Hello, everybody. We are rounding out season 1 of Type 2 and You with Meg. We only have 4 episodes left. This is one of them. I'm so incredibly grateful for all of you for listening in, and I so look forward to season 2. I already have some really interesting and special guests set up. I am really excited about some of the topics. But I also want your feedback. What do you want season 2 to look like? What did you like? What didn't you like about season 1? So in the podcast description is a survey. I'm going to leave it open for 2 weeks. So it's actually going to end on the 15th of May. Please, 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 I'm begging you, fill that out. I am so terrible about filling out surveys, and here I am asking you to fill them out for me, but I really do need your feedback. So please do that. It's in the podcast description. First in people, get a $10 Amazon gift card. This episode is all about blood sugar checking. Across the world, there are very different ways that we treat type 2 diabetes when someone's newly diagnosed, as far as access to something as simple as a glucometer. So I wanted to bring up the topic of checking blood sugars because from what I understand of my friends or listeners over in the UK and in Spain and other countries across Europe, they don't have access to a meter when they're newly diagnosed. And that is very different than the United States, where someone is newly diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and pretty much right off the bat, they get a prescription for a glucometer. Which kind of bodes the question, can you actually overcheck blood sugars? Is there a benefit to not having a meter when you're newly diagnosed? Like everything else, there's 2 sides to this coin. And my diabetes dilemma today is about how to get diabetes supplies to your doorstep.
Welcome to Type 2 and You with Meg, a diabetes podcast with the tools and guidance you need for your best life with type 2 diabetes. Your host, Megan Munoz, is a Dartmouth-trained health coach and master-prepared certified diabetes educator. She's helped thousands of people turn their diabetes fears, questions, and concerns into hope, confidence, and action. Ready to support your type 2 journey? Here's Meg.
This topic is a very interesting one because as a diabetes educator, of course, my experience tells me that really checking blood sugars, there's so much value in it. But there's also this other side of the coin, and there's some research that actually shows that people may have periods of times during diabetes when they're not on insulin or they're not on medicines that cause lows, that they really don't need to have a meter, and that there's really not a whole lot of improvement in people who are checking blood sugars and their A1C levels. However, I think there's some flaws in those studies, so I would just like to highlight my personal input on this topic. I can see both sides of the coin. So let's start with the scenario of someone taking medication that wouldn't cause a low blood sugar, let's say metformin, or taking no medication at all, and perhaps you're newly diagnosed. Is there benefit to not having a meter? And there is some benefit. Number one, of course, the obvious answer is cost. It can be costly to check blood sugars, especially if you're not checking them very often and your test strips expire or things like that. So cost is one. There's also the benefit of not having to check. I mean, if you have to check blood sugars, it's one more thing in your day. You got to figure out when you're going to do it, and if you need to take your meter somewhere to do it, all of these different things. So if you don't have to check blood sugars, that's a lot less burden on your plate. And the final big benefit of not having a meter is that you're not fixating on blood sugar levels. You can focus on the healthy behaviors that are going to impact your blood sugars, like sleep and eating patterns and activity and reducing your stress and coping skills and all these really important things that we know can lower your blood sugars and help keep them in a healthy range without having to really fixate on the numbers. And that brings me to the other side of the coin, which is I see that happen for people that do have access to meters. They're checking a lot of times of the day, and they're checking at odd times of the day, and they get really overwhelmed by their blood sugar levels, even if they're in healthy ranges. And if you're already a person that really struggles with anxiety or stress, then this can actually make things even worse for you. And additionally, some people I have seen have actually created really unhealthy eating patterns based on their blood sugars. I'm not somebody who's capable of diagnosing eating disorders or anything like that, but the people I can think of off the top of my head were people that were so extreme in their eating patterns that I could easily say that they had an eating disorder. It was just so blatant. I think a lot of that anxiety also stems from the fact that people who do get meters don't get training on them. So if you get a meter and you don't know what your blood sugar should be, what's healthy, what's not, what times of days you should check, you're really just kind of using a tool to gather information blindly and not really understanding what to do with that information, how it can help you in any of those pieces. So just to summarize, those are really the benefits of not having access to a meter. But there's a lot of benefits to having access to a meter. The first is something that's pretty obvious, which is that diabetes is invisible. It's often called a silent disease. It can be really hard to take diabetes seriously if you don't feel any different. Checking blood sugars actually gives you something tangible. It gives you something that shows what's going on inside your body where you may not have that otherwise. And I think that's a very valuable tool. I also think you need the training to learn that piece of diabetes care because, like I said, just checking blood sugars randomly does not do any good for anybody. You really have to check blood sugars around something that sparks your curiosity, around something that is concerning you. You really have to connect them to pieces of your self-care so that you can understand how those pieces impact your health. For example, if you are checking blood sugars and you're doing it around your exercise, and you compare days that you exercise versus days you don't, and you notice a 50 or 75 point difference on the days you exercise versus the days that you don't, heck, that's going to be a pretty motivating piece. And you're likely to continue doing that because you have that feedback. You recognize what that does for those inside pieces of your body that you wouldn't have known without having a glucometer. So that is a very powerful tool. That leads into this other really complicated piece of diabetes care called clinical inertia. And in a nutshell, clinical inertia is where your physician or your medical provider understands the guidelines for diabetes care, recognizes that there's a gap between where your body is as far as A1C levels and blood pressure and cholesterol and where it needs to be healthy, yet does not change your plan of care. So doesn't send you to diabetes self-management training, doesn't prescribe a new medication or whatever. That's called clinical inertia. If you have your blood sugars, you may already be recognizing that there is a need for a change. You may be seeing, wow, my blood sugars are always running 200s. I must need something different. Going into your appointment with the mindset of your blood sugars are in unhealthy ranges, that's going to trigger more conversations and you're going to advocate more aggressively for your diabetes health because you're already understanding that there's a change that needs to happen. And you have the evidence, for lack of a better word, to support that. You have the information to support that things aren't going as well with the diabetes management plan and you need help. And finally, the last benefit I want to highlight for someone actually having access to a meter is that your A1C can be different than your blood sugar checks. So remember that A1C level is something that your provider uses to make decisions about your care. And if you don't have access to a meter, that's really your only gauge on how well your diabetes is being managed and how well everything's working for you. But that A1C can be inaccurate. If you have other health conditions that affect your red blood cells, like chronic kidney disease or pregnancy or anemia can affect an A1C. Even race can affect how an A1C comes across. So someone who's Caucasian and someone who's African American who's seeing about the same level of blood sugars on their meter, someone who's African American is actually going to have their A1C show up about 0.3% higher. So a blood sugar meter in that case can actually be really critical to making sure your diabetes isn't overtreated or undertreated. Next up is my diabetes dilemma question. Stick around for my takeaway after that, because the takeaway of the day on this topic is a really critical one that I want to make sure that you get.
Diabetes dilemmas, support and answers for your diabetes questions.
My diabetes dilemma question comes from Mr. P, and he would like to know, how do I get, or where do I get online diabetes supplies that I can have delivered to my door? This is a great question, especially with everything that's going on right now. Now, how you do that, you can do it a number of different ways. So number one, whatever pharmacy that you're using now, you could ask if they offer delivery. A lot of the local pharmacies with this COVID-19 stuff are offering free delivery, even places that are chains like Walgreens and things like that. So wherever you already get your supplies, that's the first place you could look for delivery of your supplies to your doorstep. The second place you could look is a lot of times insurance companies now have what they call a mail order pharmacy that, shipped to your door. A lot of times the cost for the mail order pharmacy is cheaper, but sometimes it's a little bit trickier. I've heard not so great things about some of those companies as far as getting supplies in a timely fashion and things like that. But that's your second step, is checking in with your insurance company to see if they offer a mail order pharmacy option. And then the third option, of course, is to actually go to a diabetes supply store online that can deliver to you. So there are a number of these companies, and I have to be very honest, I don't know enough about these companies to say, well, this is a great one and this is not so great. I will tell you, a lot of these companies don't tend to take insurance. So this would be something you would pay out of pocket for these supplies. Sometimes that can be cheaper for you. Sometimes it's not. Mr. P and everybody else that's listening, I will put a link for you guys in the podcast description that kind of highlights some of these different companies. You can look through different reviews. It's actually a Consumer Reports or Consumer Affairs article or piece, but it does break down and give reviews on the different companies. So that's something that you can use as a reference, but definitely I'm not recommending any certain company. I don't know enough about them to give you a heads up on which are the best options. You're going to have to do your homework on that piece. So that's it. Number one, talk to your local pharmacy, see if they offer free delivery or reduced cost delivery. Number two, check with your insurance company to see if they offer a mail order option where you can get your supplies and medications delivered right to your door. Or option three is looking up companies that may not take insurance but may have reduced costs for some of those particular items like test strips and lancets and things like that. Thank you so much again, Mr. P, for that question, because it is so relevant right now and I really appreciate it. I actually shifted your diabetes dilemma question up in the queue because it is really something that I think a lot of people probably are wondering about right now. So great question. I really appreciate that one.
Takeaway of the day: turning your information into action.
My takeaway of the day for you on this topic of overchecking versus not checking blood sugars and the things to consider on both sides of the coin really comes down to two things. First of all, just like every other part of diabetes care, this is something that should be individualized, meaning your plan is not a cookie cutter plan. It should fit with what you need, with your resources, with your diabetes. And this is something I think we often overlook in the medical field when we help people manage their blood sugars, is that we pretty much give somebody a meter in the United States and we don't give them a whole lot of guidance on what they need to know. And then across the ocean in Europe, people aren't getting access to a meter at all across the board until they're on certain types of medicine. Either way, that blanket approach to managing diabetes is not always the best approach. And so there are times when someone may not have a meter that should. For example, if you have one of those medical conditions that could make your A1C more unreliable, like kidney disease or anemia. On the flip side, there may be somebody who gets a meter and is asked to check their blood sugars when really they don't need to be checking. I think about somebody who's in their 80s and they're newly diagnosed and their A1C is just barely over the line. We're not going to be super aggressive in someone's care when they're 85 and they just got diagnosed with diabetes and their A1C is not inappropriate for their age or their health conditions. And those are just 2 examples. That does not mean an exclusive example of who should check and who shouldn't check. And that brings me to my second takeaway, which is I want to evoke the logical side of you when it comes to checking blood sugars. What is the purpose behind checking? The entire purpose is to guide your diabetes care, to help you understand what's working, what you need to continue to do, what's not working, what you might need to change, when you might need to change things. That's ultimately the point of checking, is literally to make decisions about your care. So even if you have access to a meter, but you don't have training on it, you don't know what your blood sugar should be, you don't know when you're supposed to be checking, and you don't know what you're supposed to do with the information, then it is almost like not having one at all. For example, let's say you have access to a glucometer, and lately you've been really struggling with your blood sugars, and every time you check, you're 200s. If you haven't had a discussion with your medical team on is there something you're supposed to do different, and when does that happen? Are you supposed to be more active if you are seeing those numbers? Are you supposed to be taking extra medication? Are you supposed to be changing your sleep habits or your eating patterns? Are you supposed to be calling the doc in a week or 2 if you're seeing those numbers on a regular basis? At the end of the day, it really isn't about the meter. It's about what your plan is for your diabetes care. And having a meter and seeing numbers on it means absolutely nothing if you don't have a thought process, a pattern, an idea of what to do with the information. So that is my big overarching takeaway from this conversation is regardless of where you come from, regardless of what your diabetes plan is, making sure you have a really good conversation with your medical team, your medical provider, about whether you should be using a meter or not. What does it look like for you if you do need to use a meter? How often? What should you do with the information? When are you supposed to call? If you don't have a meter, at what point does it happen? Would your doctor work with you if you wanted to have a meter? All of those pieces are things that should be individualized to you. I'm hoping you will walk away from this conversation with the idea that I just really want to have that conversation the next time I'm in there with my medical team, with my doctor, my medical professional. You know, we're really good at individualizing diabetes care at certain points of someone's experience, but this is one where I still see a lot of gaps in making sure that people get what they need at the right time, whether it's not checking, whether it's checking minimally, whether it's checking a lot. There's a lot of variety in what people need to have access to and what they need to do. That's it for today's episode. Don't forget about the survey in the podcast description. Please fill it out. Again, first 10 listeners that fill out that survey will get a $10 Amazon gift card emailed to them. And next week is going to be about diabetes and thyroid disease. This is something I've had a lot of questions about from you guys, so I want to make sure that this episode happens before the end of the season. Tune in next week, and in the meantime, don't forget, the number one thing you can do to manage your diabetes is bet on you.
Keep current on new episodes by subscribing to Type 2 and You with Meg. Be sure to share a link of today's episode to someone you know living with Type 2 diabetes. Want to learn more about today's topic or need answers to your diabetes dilemmas? Contact Megan by using the links in the podcast description or visiting her webpage, type2andyou.org. This podcast is for informational purposes only and not intended as medical advice.